On behalf of the organizer of this event, Mr. Richard Howitt, European member of the European Parliament, on behalf of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development and Vredeseilanden, we are glad that we could get a lot of people into this provocative seminar today. This provocative seminar is the fifth in a series, which are addressing issues that have to do with market access, pro-poor farming, business and pro-poor farming. And we are very glad that we, at this moment, can have got this type of a seminar which has traveled throughout Europe, here in Brussels and also in the European Parliament. So we're also very grateful to Mr. Richard Howitt. I will give the word now to Carol Gripnau. She will be moderating the session of today.
Thank you, Chris. So yes, I'm Carol Gripnau. I'm working for Hivos. And I will be facilitating this session. As Chris already mentioned, this is the fifth provocation, the last in a series of provocations we've organized over the last few months. And all of them were set up in order to stimulate a critically constructive debate around the agenda of making markets work for smallholder producers. The provocations were always organized in association with Hivos IIED knowledge program. It's a joint knowledge program on smallholder agency in a globalized market. And for each provocation, we involved local partners. And we were very happy to have Vredeseilanden, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, and of course, Richard Howitt on board to organize this session. In the European Parliament. So thank you for that. I don't know if all of you were part of the earlier provocations, but for those who are interested, you can find reports of the 4 provocations, which were organized in The Hague, in Stockholm, in Paris, and in Manchester, on the IIED website and Hivos website. So you can see, the different topics which were addressed in these provocations. So this one, the fifth, is on pro-poor business, development, and smallholder empowerment. You've all received the program or the announcement of this provocation. I already want to mention that there's one change in the sense that Sophie Tranchel, who was supposed to be a speaker, has been replaced by Miguel Castellanos of SNV. So we were very happy to get him on board at the last moment, I must say. So what are we going to discuss in this provocation? Well, what we've seen all is that the private sector has become more inclusive of the rural poor. We see different approaches like fair trade, which we've seen already for many, many years, corporate social responsibility, but also other inclusive business models have come up, and they claim to meet both commercial and social objectives. So this provocation is really about what do they deliver on their promises? What do we see in reality? How are they also evolving over time? Like fair trade started, I think, over 20 years ago. So what are the changes? And what are also the challenges? We will have 6 speakers. But that doesn't mean that they are the ones bearing all the knowledge on this topic. We assume that all of you will have a lot of experience and knowledge on this particular topic. So you're all invited to actively participate in this debate, which is really intended to be a debate. And just to get a sense of who we have in the audience, I mean, can those who are from the private sector raise their hands? Okay, interesting. So, interesting to see. Are there also representatives of smallholders in the room? But all of us were, yeah, at least. We have a few. And I think that all of you will be very much transferring experiences you have of working directly with smallholders in inclusive business or pro-poor business approaches. So how is this session going to be organized? We will have 2 different sessions. Each session will be introduced by 3 speakers. Each one of them will have maximum of 15 minutes to raise a number of issues. We've asked all of them to be rather provocative. And after that, it's up to you to come up with other issues or to comment, to say whether you agree or you don't agree. Or we want to avoid having a question and answer kind of debate, but really have a debate where we try to see if there are some common grounds we can agree on, or what are the major challenges or differences of opinion within this debate. So the role of the panel is really to feed the debate, to put some fire into the debate, but all of you can do that as well. I would like to ask you all to use the microphone, because this whole session will be filmed. It will be very useful for them to hear you speaking very clearly. With the other provocations, there was live streaming, which allowed people, for instance, from the south, to come in with questions or comments. This time that was not feasible, but it will be videoed, as I already mentioned, and it will be available also in English and Spanish online Monday, I think, so very soon. And we've had a number of comments from the south already. So we have different ways of bringing in the voice of the South, but also to share what is being said here with the South, but also other organizations. So I would like to start with the first session. The first session is really centered around what are the main issues or problems associated with achieving smallholder empowerment through pro-poor business models. I would like to introduce 3 speakers: Richard Howard, Sanjeev Ashtana, and Chris Bacon. The first speaker will be Richard Howard, and I think you will also welcome us all on behalf of the European Parliament. We're very happy that you were able to organize this session here. I think it's a very interesting location, very strategic as well. So we will hope that there are people from the European Union already in the room or might pop in as well to just get a feeling of what's being debated. As already mentioned, you're a member of the European Parliament and rapporteur on corporate social responsibility, and I would like to give the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much, and indeed I do warmly welcome all of you to the European Parliament. I think it is an advantage of having the event here that there will be an opportunity for some of the other MEPs, parliamentary staff, researchers to also be party to the discussion. So I think it helps you, but it also helps me that you're here, and I'm really pleased that you're here. I thank all of the partners. I would just pay a special mention to IIED, who in 15 years now, when I've served as Parliament's Rapporteur on Corporate Social Responsibility, have informed my work and advised me, and it's great to be supporting one of your events with the other partners here today. I want to, in these introductory remarks, not focus very tightly on the food chain and small producers, because frankly there's a lot of experts about this that I want to learn from rather than speak to on that issue. But I think it's relevant at the beginning of today's provocation, what a wonderful word, to just say a little bit about the wider context from the strand of this that I'm coming from, corporate social responsibility and accountability, why it clearly is a development issue, some of the approaches on that we've engaged in, some good examples which have involved empowerment in the South, and some pleas to you about part of the follow-up I'd like you to engage with as part of the follow-up to all of these different symposia. So point 1, we meet at an exciting time. If you're a corporate social responsibility and accountability nut, as I am, itching away at this issue over a large number of years, we really are in a different position than we were 5 or 10, let alone 15 years ago. So Europe's multi-stakeholder forum which in the past, and my friend and colleague Dwight Justice over there has been sitting there watching it and taking part in it along with me. I proposed setting this up now over 10 years ago, and it has been a bit of a battleground where companies have sometimes tried to limit what their ambitions are, in a way actually not at all representative of companies themselves, European companies themselves. The associations in Brussels have been stuck in a mindset which is a very defensive one, which doesn't actually reflect their own members, in my view, let alone other stakeholder groups. But over the last 2 years, and culminating in a meeting where we had, I think, 2,000 people just before Christmas, there definitely is a different mindset now. I'm not saying that there aren't key and difficult issues to deal with, but there is a mindset to say that businesses now accept greater responsibility. Many of them would say they propose it and initiate it, and that the European Union and its institutions have got a much more open and constructive mind to how we add value and further and incentivise and promote all of that. So there's a much more constructive attitude going on at the European Union level on these corporate responsibility issues. Secondly, within the last month, we've seen the agreement of the up-rated OECD guidelines on multinational enterprise. In my view, they are the most authoritative international standard on corporate responsibility. Roel Nieuwenkamp from the Netherlands chaired that process. He's a personal friend and colleague of mine, and he and all of them have done, in my view, a brilliant job. The key about the OECD guidelines is that they are in that soft law area. People say they're voluntary, but in their soft law area, they are signed up to by governments. We have national contact points that look at complaints and adjudicate on them, mediate and adjudicate on them, and are extremely relevant to business practice in developing countries, including a third of signatories to the guidelines who are not OECD members. You know, the big criticism of that could be it's a rich man's club, deliberately said man, but in reality, countries throughout Latin America and Asia, less Africa at the moment, have also been signing up, and I'd like to see more, by the way, and I think that should be part of our plan. Then, in the last 2 weeks, with the official agreement last week, John Ruggie's Framework for Business and Human Rights in the UN Human Rights Council was passed. And I cannot tell you how that has changed the weather on corporate responsibility issues internationally, because in the UN Human Rights Council we have seen unanimous agreement and support for the fact that businesses must and can do much better with respect to human rights. They can't just say it, they have to do it, and they have to demonstrate it through his concept of due diligence. And it's very important to say that the International Chambers of Commerce, the International Organisation of Employers, let alone all of the member states of the UN Human Rights Council, are all signed up to that, and not reluctantly. A few years ago, you might remember there was a whole debate over guidelines on business and human rights through the subcommittee that was very polarised, and there was a lot of disagreement. Add 5-6 years on, and we're in a different place internationally, and that's been extremely important. We then, last Friday, here in Brussels, had the latest in a set of global roundtables that we've been organising on behalf of something called the International Integrated Reporting Committee. Right, I'm going to ask, who's heard of that? Put your hand up. Right, fewer people than the private enterprise people in the room. And it's the least sexy title for the most sexy thing, right? Which is the idea that businesses incorporate social, environment and human rights reporting in their financial reporting in an integrated fashion, and we're going to do it as a world by 2020. And the major social and environmental auditing world bodies, the Global Reporting Initiative, and if I can be British for a moment, the Prince of Wales Accounting for Sustainability project, have together with the major accountancy bodies worldwide, advanced this process. We're hoping it will be endorsed at the G20 in October, and that's something I'm personally working on. A consultation will be opened within a month or so on this. So again, it's a really exciting moment in terms of bringing social, environmental and human rights performance of companies together with financial performance for the first genuine time. And then again, here in the European Union, in September of this year, the European Commission are due to publish a communication to set forth the next stage in terms of where we want to go at a European Union level. And I'm very grateful to them and am influencing that process and look forward to that publication. And I believe that there are going to be some very good and interesting steps there, including on the issue of disclosure. So, exciting times. Point 2, this is a development issue. If you want to know what motivates me and my work over 15 years and what is a guiding principle for me, I am not interested in Europe just doing the right thing within the European boundaries, because the European Parliament represents the citizens of Europe, and what the citizens of Europe are most worried about in terms of corporate performance and lack of corporate responsibility are sweatshops in developing countries, export processing zones in developing countries where labour standards are routinely, sometimes legally, ignored. They're worried about mining and extractive projects. They're worried about palm oil plantations. And that is perhaps the most relevant thing for this meeting, where companies, often from Europe, have been involved in major projects that they say is improving the prosperity in the developing country, but in reality is actually a negative one as far as smallholders, peasant farmers, local communities, indigenous communities are concerned. Or they're worried about human rights abuses, whether it be in conflict zones with private security firms who are supposedly protecting staff actually being complicit in human rights abuses, or host country agreements whereby major multinationals have come in and said to governments of developing countries, you have to waive your right to regulate us, even to monitor our compliance with human rights, or we won't give you the investment. Utterly outrageous that that takes place. And those are the things that European citizens are worried about. And I'm not saying all companies do them, and I'm not saying that it's the standard, but I am saying that if we are to deal with issues of corporate responsibility, those are the ones we should worry about. And therefore, in my work, I have championed, starting off with a series of hearings that we held on the impact of European companies in developing countries in the Development Committee of this Parliament. I've championed looking at the responsibility of European corporations in developing countries as the first test of whether our policies are really making a difference. And have championed as well the idea that we are not interested in a sort of Europe-only solution on CSR. We are interested in global solutions and how Europe can properly participate in those and apply them within our own boundaries. So that's point 2. Point 3, you're all aware of this because you're specialists in the field, but there have been a series of specific issues around development and corporate responsibility that we've dealt with, which show, that we're not starting from zero. The whole anti-corruption thing is absolutely crucial because, as you understand, and we need the wider community to understand, that if we're worried about development, we have to be worried about good governance in the governments of developing countries. And if we're worried about good governance in the governments of developing countries, we have to be worried about how good governance and anti-corruption by business, their own business, but our business working with their own business, working with their governments, can actually promote that good governance. And it's, the people who are anti-corruption have been sort of banging on for years about this, and who shouldn't be anti-corruption. But I think now there is a much greater understanding that this is a development issue. Right? This isn't just a fairness or moral issue or justice issue. It's also a development issue because it's holding back developing countries in the development process. Or the whole issues of transfer pricing and the payment of fair tax by companies, which is a crucial issue, and it remains on the table. And the whole Publish What You Pay campaign, absolutely brilliant in my view, and the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is linked to that. And it does show how the world is changing on corporate responsibility, because for many times companies would say this is commercially sensitive and we can't say it, but now they do. And it is shown to be possible. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but we have definitely moved forward. Similarly, the Kimberley process on conflict diamonds, and I think the whole issues around conflict minerals, coltan in the Democratic Republic of Congo, again, is a key test for whether we make a difference, and it was for John Ruggie as well. Whole issues around investment. I'm on the advisory board for the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. But if we want to change what you want to change, the power of investment to do that is huge. It's, you know, we've got a responsibility from the world of regulation and government and legislation. I accept that. But there's also a huge potential through investment. And again, UNPI, far from perfect, but the rules of the international financial institutions are rather different now than they were a few years ago. But are they properly being applied? I hope you'll discuss that today. And finally, in terms of these themes, the supply chain issue. For a long time, companies said we could only be responsible for ourselves, and then drew a very tight line around what they called themselves, which is their head office, and the administrative staff didn't even include the cleaners and the caterers, by the way, in their head office, let alone what they were doing in Zimbabwe or Botswana or Papua New Guinea. And the great thing that Ruggie has done, and in the OECD guidelines, is we've nailed that argument. On the Ruggie work, what he says, it's you have to measure the human rights impact. So it's where you have most impact, and that clearly is not in the lift on the way up to the managing director's office. And what the OECD guideline says, they get rid of this investment nexus, so it's only around the direct investment. It again has to be the supply chain. I'm not saying it's easy, but again, we've moved a long way on from where we are. Time's running. A lot of that is very conceptual, and I just want to say, especially for the audience that are watching on video across the south of the world, it really does mean something to us, and we want it to mean something to you. So, for example, in the multi-stakeholder forum, we've had companies that are working in Africa talking through what it's like to have a workforce riven with HIV/AIDS, and knowing that the average tenure of people in the workforce is 500, 600, 7% turnover because of that, knowing that the problems of AIDS orphans are problems of the company because they're problems of its employees, and working through those issues about how you be a responsible employer in Africa because of it. Or we know, I just pay respect that UNRISD is one of the partners today. UNDP is one of the key partners that has helped us push out corporate responsibility policies across Eastern and now Southeastern Europe, and is a key agency in terms of developing this at the world level. Or the Ethical Trading Initiative from my own country that has looked, for example, at the wine industry in South Africa and has started to actually say we can pay more. We can pay more, and consumers can pay more, and companies can pay more, as long as we can see what we get back. And of course, that's a fundamental tenet of the fair trade movement, which many of us are supporters of. So I hope those words are meaningful to you. And you're going to look in detail at some of these issues around small business and peasant farmers and ownerships in developing countries. But what I appeal to you is to, in doing that, bring those lessons back into these wider debates, into my work, the work of the European Union, and into these wider debates, and help us deliver what you want to deliver through these mechanisms, because these mechanisms are there and they're working and they're relevant, and we need you to be engaging in those processes as much as I hope you may need us to deliver what we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it was very interesting to have this overview of what is happening in the field of corporate social responsibility, and I'm very happy with your invitation to bring the lessons from this provocation also into the broader debate. I think that's really one of the challenges with all these provocations and the insights we're gaining to really bring it forward so that others can make use of it and change policies, strategies, and so on. So thank you. I'm not sure you're going to stay a few more minutes, and then you will leave and pop in later on as well. So we'll see you again. Okay. Then I would like to introduce the second speaker, which is Chris Bacon. He's a professor of environmental politics and policy of the Santa Clara University. He's also co-author of the publication Confronting the Coffee Crisis, Fair Trade, Sustainable Livelihoods and Ecosystems in Mexico and Central America. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to go ahead and start out. I was thinking about this question, and thank you again for your introductory comments and setting this into the big picture. Flying from California, it is always, and from the United States, refreshing to see these broad-based debates that are underway. In thinking through these questions, or what are the main issues associated with achieving smallholder empowerment through the pro-poor business models? The first, kind of one of the take-home points I want to give you right up front is, I think overall, some of the certification agencies and some of these business models have overstated, and the media certainly, as well as sometimes the development organizations and the companies, have overstated the agency that the certification can have, right? And sometimes overstated the impact, but really overstated the power of a certification. And in my sense, and I'll talk a little bit about this when I try to give us a few concepts quickly about what do we mean by empowerment. And I would say, notwithstanding the incredible work that's being done, and we'll speak briefly about that, we'll look briefly at the practice, and in my second point, we'll talk about some of the pitfalls, because we're supposed to highlight some of the pitfalls in this provocation, and then explore some of the possibilities and hopefully link up to the wider framework that was laid out for us. I think when we talk about what I mean by overstating is we've often see the faces of the hardworking smallholders in the South that are behind our food, the crop behind the cup, and this has certainly provided a huge wake-up call in many ways in the consciousness of consumers who are also coffee drinkers or not, or maybe they're tea drinkers or banana eaters, and also citizens. We can't forget that a consumer is a citizen as well, right? And I think that's great about being in this space. But while we've often seen the face behind the fork, less often have we heard the voice of the representative of the smallholder producers in this area and begin to understand how some of these certifications, some of these different business models might fit into livelihoods looking from the bottom up, which I think we need to look at two places. We need to look in the fields, and we need to look at the governance questions in the boardrooms. So I would say, before getting too much further in, a couple of quick stories. As a professor in the university, we often host exchanges that bring small-scale farmers up from different countries in Central America or from around the world. And I remember my students asking a young woman, she was probably about 20, about their age, well, what is really the impact of fair trade, for example? And she said, well, if it wasn't for the cooperative that I'm a member of, and if it wasn't for fair trade, I wouldn't be here right now telling you the story of my life. And that's true. It's absolutely, she started out, she was born to workers on a large plantation that was close to a feudal model. They gained access to land through an agrarian reform process, and then one of the most significant changes in the life was when they formed a cooperative to defend the rights of the land title, and then gradually learned about fair trade, which played an important role in strengthening that organization. Also, students have used, on the other hand, and this is more about smallholders, but I don't think we should forget the consumers or the activists that are working for food justice in a lot of places. So, for example, in the United States, one thing I'm happy to have been a part of is advising a student movement where students have run campaigns on campuses across the country. I know this has happened in the UK as well as other places, around using fair trade as one of the tools for their social justice work. And some of it's been about taking control of their food system. So what does the coffee that they get at lunch look like, or they get at break? And they've been, over 100 campuses have organized and used this as an organizing tool. So I think one way to understand this is how do some of these certifications, or how do these business models fit into the livelihoods and the aspirations of the individuals and groups that use it to achieve their empowerment processes. And that kind of brings me to the second sort of introductory point about empowerment. A couple of quick conceptual points is we might think about it at the individual level. A simple definition is maybe the capacity of individuals or groups to act in order to achieve their self-defined goals without impinging on the human rights of others. And we can think on analysis what actions have been taken, who's taken them, how have they been achieved, and we can think about the personal as well as the collective dimensions, right? Have they been able to personally influence the relationships they are a part of and avoid being parts of exploitative relations? We think of the uneven gender relations in so many households in so many places around the world, right? Have they been able to organize collectively to achieve their goals collectively, either at the community level or at the national level or beyond? Do they have moments of reflection to not only the action and the organizing, but of critical reflection? So these are some cases I think it's worth thinking about. And finally, as we step into the value chain and we ask some of these questions about the pro-poor business models, are we seeing power of standards over certain smallholders in their livelihoods and farming practices, or are we seeing power generated with? And the preposition becomes important, right? You can share power with and participate in the empowerment process of another, but having power over and setting standards, I remember in one of the forums we organized an African producer saying, sometimes I feel like these standards are, it was cold, it was Boston in February, right? So these standards are coming down upon us like this thing you call snow, right? I mean, so sometimes it feels that way. I think the debate has moved forward, but we shouldn't, I don't want to forget that on the other side. Thank you. So in terms of the practice, a couple points I want to make about practice, and I'll move into my three key areas right now. At the individual level, I'll do my best in 3 to 4 minutes to summarize as a researcher involved in assessing the community level impacts in the livelihoods and landscapes of many small-scale producers in Latin America and the Caribbean, and reading about parts of Asia and Africa. I won't be able to speak as authoritatively in that area. Some of the key sort of take-home points on the impacts now, stepping inside the fair trade model and leaving some of the larger CSR, corporate social responsibility debates to one side. I would say at the individual level, we've seen significant impacts in terms of enabling many small-scale producers to access land, gain land tenure, and achieve some of their self-defined goals. This cannot be underestimated. In other areas, we've seen benefits in terms of education. The fact that young woman, Darling, that I started out with, 20-year-old, she had was involved in the university. Her parents maybe had a 2nd to 3rd grade education, maybe 6th grade at the most. She was in the university, and this is not uncommon. It's not, you have to do the statistics on a broad scale, but in general, there's been some evidence from Nicaragua as well as Guatemala and other countries showing the average number of years completed in school is often higher among households that are connected through a cooperative into fair trade. We also must admit that persistent livelihood insecurities are there. There are sometimes periods of seasonal hunger that people are not rocketing out of poverty, right? And some of the marketing, and when I get to the pitfalls, I'll talk more about this, has oversold some of those impacts, I would say. Environmental benefits are still underplayed, I would say. The biodiversity conserved, for example, in a shade coffee farm, it's well known and yet uncompensated for. I would say this is a subsidy that many smallholders are providing both the planet as well as other citizens in other places in terms of the biodiversity and the ecosystem services that are conserved in these landscapes. If we scale up, we've seen that the ability of creating a smallholder producer organization that's accountable to its members, of being organized, is a critical step in empowerment. So once you have your own organization, there's so many more possibilities that open up. At national level, we've seen everything from these producer organizations actually gaining a foothold in the national policymaking processes, competing toe-to-toe with the private exporters and the transnational companies that have historically, since colonialism, held a strong grip on the power. And this is incredibly significant, not to be underestimated. We don't know what the impacts will look like in the fields yet, but we know at the organizational level they've started to play out. So I want to move forward to thinking about some of the pitfalls. This is a critical part. I think when we look at the question of governance, one window into the question of governance is around the question of standards and prices and how standards are set and how standards are revised. There's a politics that goes into this process that is too often unquestioned. And and sometimes technified in a way to avoid the politics. I'll give a quick example. Within fair trade, there's been heated debates, which many people are aware, for example, about the minimum prices. Some research I was involved in suggested the minimum price has not kept up. There's not been a cost of living adjustment built in for small-scale producers, and so it has not kept up with the rising cost of living, with inflation is one way to look at it. Now, there were massive debates inside the board of directors, and there's a number of smallholder producer representatives on the board of directors, and they use some of the research and their collective advocacy, as well as the advocacy of many civil society organizations, to increase the price about 15%. They quadrupled the social premium over the last 3 or 4 years. And these debates were sometimes, they were very contested and on and off, but I would say in the end that this contestation and this debate inside of a certification is a sign of to some degree is a sign of empowerment, because the other alternative is, what if there are no smallholder producer seats in the boardroom at the table, right? Maybe there's only 2 or 3 out of 12, but that's more than many of the other certifications. If we step out and we look at a comparison to some of the other pro-poor business models, right, we might look at some other certifications like Rainforest Alliance or UTSCAPE, who have important impacts on their own, but there's not these huge debates around standards or minimum prices. The other question about market access, who's in, who's out, it's been very debated about the inclusion of plantations, of of unions having a say at the table. All these debates, I would say, are highly contested, yet they are a sign of a healthy, to some extent, a healthy a more democratic certification. Now, I would say, if we look closely at this model, it's less, the impact has been less than it used to be, because the original model was to create it wasn't just how to make the markets work for the poor. It was actually about making a different market that was inclusive of the voices and conscious of the impacts that could have among smallholders in the global south, right? So this distinction about making a different market together is distinct from a model of simply including smallholders into a market that may have already excluded them historically and where the impacts are less well known. So I want to close in thinking quickly about a couple of possibilities. I would argue it is time to reinvigorate the governance, both within fair trade more. There's some missing seats at the table. There's some missing voices, right? The work that many activists, drinkers, eaters, or consumers is not present. Smallholders don't have a full representation. But if we step out and we look into the fields quickly, the questions around food security are becoming increasingly important, and the idea of linking the global markets with more of a focus on relocalizing markets, but in a reflexive way that ensures food security and a sense of justice, doesn't reinscribe the current inequalities that are present. And then finally, I would ask, sort of ending on the note that we started, is what can, in addition to what fair trade can contribute to produce smallholders empowerment processes, what can fair trade contribute to these wider debates about corporate social responsibility? Instead of following this model, what can be contributed from the understandings in this area about these debates? So I'll end on this point and be happy to engage in dialogue after this.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. I think this will provoke a lot of debate. It's good to know also that in the second session we will have a representative of fair trade small producer organizations who will also have an opportunity to say something from that point of view. But for now, I would like to continue with the third speaker, Mr. Sanjeev Asthana from India. He's founder and chairman of the National Skills Foundation of India, which is a not-for-profit initiative engaged in skill development of unemployed rural youth. But he's also on the board of directors of Ruchi Soya Industries Limited and Ruchi Infrastructure Limited as well. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Carol. Good morning. What I'm going to sort of structure my whole presentation around is that, in terms of the quality of debate and type of debate which is around the small producers, in the developing country context is very different than what we hear in Europe or what we hear in North America. And there are serious challenges in the way it is being debated and how this whole thing is developing, from a debate perspective and in terms of the policy and how it gets implemented. So my presentation will have basically three modules. One, that how the government interface, which is so crucial in the developing economies because they've got such a critical role to play. How there is a gap despite all the good intents in terms of what is announced and how it is actually done, and ultimately how the achievement against that is seen. Second part is in terms of the emergence of large private sector organizations as they're emerging. Both in terms of the retail organizations, in terms of the multinationals who are coming, and where exactly, despite all the stated intent and good work what they're doing, how that is playing out. And last part of my presentation is going to focus in terms of the issues related to what possibly could be the, some of the middle ground what we see, and what can sort of be done around it, both at the policy level where the government is concerned, and at another level where the private sector could play an important role. So to begin with, let me just say that in terms of the progress part of it, rather than an extreme view that nothing has happened or a lot has happened, I think clearly a whole bunch of progress has taken place over the years. And but having said that, a lot more needs to be done. And I think clearly that is where the struggle is, that where do you find the middle ground, and what makes the best sense. If you've read that in today's the G20 Ag Ministers meet in Paris, even the IFPRI has suggested that the small producers have an extremely critical role to play in the food security of the world. And this sign we are seeing in the developing economies as well, that while the size and the absolute numbers are large, but the opportunity as to what it presents itself in terms of making a decisive difference to the way this entire debate around the food security, the international trade, the lot of small producers, and how it can make a very decisive dent into their good lot and what they can do differently. And of course, before I plunge into the presentation, that in terms of what is right and what is wrong, I think it's highly contextual. So there are frameworks which have developed. What works in Latin America perhaps may not have the same degree of applicability, because on both accounts, in terms of the levels of agriculture and the public debate or the government policy or the private sector evolution may be very different in Africa. And what works in India may be very different than what it might be working from a prescriptive part of it would not work. So agriculture, one of the key parts which I want to mention is that agriculture, the small producers, and the business of value chain around which it is evolving is very driven by the local situation. It's very local. The frameworks are very different. The circumstances under which they're operating are extremely different. And within that reach, we need to talk about as to what size fits. So one size fitting all will not work at all. And I think that is where this whole discussion as to what exactly is going to happen and how it works out. So I'm going to talk about from a very Indian standpoint right now. So that is one I sort of took up to talk about. So let me give a sort of in terms of what is the political economy around the agriculture in India. And maybe I'll throw out some stock numbers which for the purpose of, in terms of what I'm going to say. India has about nearly 120 million farmers, and give or take a couple of million here or there, on a land base of about 142 million hectares. And almost 2/3 of the farmer and more are holding less than 2 hectares of land. But from the perspective of the contribution what they make to the overall sort of ag economy, in terms of if you look at the proportion of land what they hold, their contribution is larger than the large farmers in absolute terms as well. And which means that they've been contributing in a significant way into this whole sort of work around the agriculture business. And yet, if we look at the, their lot in terms of the economic progress what they've made, they are poor to extremely poor, and have a huge amount of challenges in the way they are sort of managing the business of agriculture. And that's another point I'll just come briefly when I talk about the business sort of role in that. And their whole mainstream access. So when you talk about the fair trade, you talk about the how the various models have worked in the developed economies, you realize that entire access to the mainstream ag economy or supply chain or the value chains has really worked only through either the village level consolidators, the local traders, or with a lot of political sort of twist to the whole thing, and that has been their only touch to the world. So whether it in terms of the information, whether in terms of the extension, there are only two modes which are available to them. One is the what the government does, and that extension system is sort of leaves a lot to be sort of desired, because they're still in the old age practice of how the agriculture was working. They haven't sort of kept to the tune of the developments which have taken place. And the second part is through their local traders who sort of have been actively working along with them. And yet I find that why this opportunity is big, because the role of small producers in the emerging areas of the ag economy as it is building up, India is from the whole economic progress, what it has driven is there's a lot of demand for various produce which are typically in the hands of the small producers. So whether it's around the milk business, the production of milk, whether it's around the horticulture value chains, whether it's around the poultry business, the ag producers are doing it. And studies after studies have proven that in terms of the employment intensity and in terms of the opportunity to build up the income level, these businesses tend to provide much larger income, and there's a lot more employment which can be provided at the farm level. And yet, when you look at the whole policy paradigm around it, that whether it's the good intent with which the policies are made, there is always a bias which is creeping into it, because whether the articulation was not there, or in terms of the gaps in how it is implemented is clearly a big challenge. So, for instance, if I take an example of the subsidies, we almost give $25 billion of subsidy on the fertilizer. There's another $20 billion of subsidy in the way the food is procured, which is primarily around the food grains. And there's another $20 billion of subsidy, which is on the food distribution. And at all these three levels, you clearly find that despite the large numbers and scale, the bias is always that somehow at the wrong end of the stick, the small producers have ended. So if you look at the fertilizer subsidy, the lot of subsidy is going typically to the large producers in the areas which have either been politically active or they've got the support. If you look at the entire procurement program of the government, it is very biased towards the large producers in the northwestern part of the country, which is around the wheat and rice. And if you look at the whole food distribution program, again, the bias has been towards the richer states, usurping large parts of the doles and grants which have gone in their way. And this has thrown a very typical set of challenges in the way it has sort of come about. The second issue has been that in many a times, the organized structures as we have sought, so whether it was around the cooperatives, whether it was around the self-help groups, whether it was around the producer companies, which a lot of them have come about, they have not found any institutional mechanism in which they could self-organize themselves, and that could grow, and that has been a big issue in the way they got structured. So with the result that in terms of the terms of trade, really they dealt with the small trader or the consolidators in a very one-to-one basis, which has not given them any empowerment, whether in terms of the price negotiation, the terms of trade, or otherwise, it's been against that. And ultimately, from a very governmental standpoint, that the whole sort of debate around the one-off loan waiver, that a couple of years back, the entire sort of financial loans which the producers had taken were waived off in one stroke, are not the solutions. You cannot give out the grants. You cannot give out the doles to the producers. What hasn't been found is that the institutional mechanism of making the institution strong, setting up structures in place which the terms of trade can be bargained by the producers, putting together the practices where the producers are not ending at the wrong end of the stick. And I think those mechanisms ultimately needs to be strengthened, and where I think has been a gap in the way the government has sort of worked and how it needs to be ultimately sort of driven home, where these models are, there are some fledgling progress, what we're seeing a lot on the ground level, but not enough has happened, where they can make a difference to their own lot and which will make an impact. If I come to the issue of the private sector, and which again I was part of, and prior to that as well, in terms of what the MNCs have come and what the large companies have done, I think clearly there are two big gaps. One is that a very traditional mindset within the multinational companies, that what the experiments were carried out in Africa or Latin America, and this is the best model to work in India, has not worked at all. I think clearly there's been a lot more challenge at the ground level, which are not as simplistic in terms of the understanding, has been a problem. The bigger challenge has been really in terms of how do they engage with the small producers. So all of them are working very hard in terms of working closely with the producers. But the challenge really has been that they've not found a viable business model to reach out to the small producer. So very clear part, the last mile connectivity to the small producers. If you look at the sheer numbers, that how do you deal with the scale and size of the producers what you have, there is an expense involved, and it's extremely expensive. The supply chain build-up with the producer is extremely expensive in the country. At a second level, the challenge has been that how do you create a viable, the economically negotiable unit? I mean, is there a minimum volume which you need to do? How do you deal with, a producer who comes and sells you, $5 worth of goods every day? And if you're dealing with thousands of them, I mean, what kind of IT systems you need to put in place, what kind of handling systems you need to have in place, and how do you drive reform that point? And that is one big gap. So both in terms of the expense, what they had to incur, I mean, the viability of the business model, and B, in terms of creating those units with whom they could negotiate sensible way, it has not come about at all. And with the result that the private sector also tends to drop at the drop of a hat back to the dependence on the traders and the archaic mandi system through which they continue to work with, and that's been the second challenge. Another part in terms of the capacity building, ultimately what is found is that the business of agriculture is not strictly around just the, buying of the produce. It's a lot more to do with the, the ability of the farmer to understand as to what goes on in the process of agriculture in terms of how they manage the farm input, what the practices are, how exactly can he do it better, and which is very different than what we find the debate in, the OECD countries around the agriculture, where the farmers desperately need this part as well, which they need to work well, and which has not been an issue. So really the whole capacity building exercise hasn't happened to the extent where it ought to have been done. And the last part I would say is, which is in terms of, the whole sort of provocation part, that, what is the seriousness and intent, that there's a lot of talk about the CSR, the budgets which are being spent. How serious is the CSR in terms of, what genuinely is going, is CSR one department which sits away from the business team and does something on its own, which has got no relevance to what's happening at the ground level? How do you mainstream the CSR in terms of the business models what are being followed, so there is a level of impact which they can make? And how does it become more sustainable and viable? I think this is one part which clearly the private sector needs to work very closely on. The other part, of course, which is in a small passing term I'll mention, is that this whole issue around the local trade, which was extremely competitive. So large companies, despite all the intent what they did, they could not break into the long-term relationship with the producers had with the local trader. They could not manage the systems of assessing the risk, where large part of financial sort of advances were being given by the local trade to the producers, which you could not break that umbilical cord which had formed over decades, and that was a big issue. And in terms of the political influence at the ground level, the trade has, that in terms of a lot of decision making which happens at the ground level of the government machinery and the political manipulation which is possible in a social setting, the big companies or the small companies have just not been able to figure that out, and making serious effort in terms of the evidence-based sort of work, making in terms of the objective assessment, and staying the long term. Engaged with the engaged with the small producer, I think is an absolutely critical element, rather than dropping off and saying, no, it would not work, and I would rather go and, go with the large trader or small trader, and that is not a solution, and I think that is one part of it. Last but not the least, I think small one for the producer, which is extremely important, is that even the small producers in their own orientation, because they've been so stressed over decades, they have been transactional as well. So how do you develop that relationship with the companies were able to build up? So again, if they're not happy with the company, they immediately go back to the local trader, or they'll go to somebody else to sell. I mean, they have been desperately finding a solution as to whom they build up a long-term alliance with, and I think that is where this entire engagement between corporates and the producers had been at a very transactional level, and which hasn't found its deep root in the way we can build up sustainable models. Going to the last part of the solution, and while there are no fixed solution in the complexities what we have, I think clearly on the reforms part, I think government needs to sort of let go of a lot of things which are happening. So this is a constitutional problem in the country, that act being a state subject. There's a lot of influencing with the central government may try, which is very typical about India. It does not happen in a very easy manner. In terms of the targeting the programs, that one size, and India is also sort of guilty of that from a policy formation level, that yes, the farmers, we are going to deal across the country like this. It's not true. I mean, India is a confederation of states, and the problems in south versus the west and north are extremely different. And this is on the policy level itself, they need to figure out as to what makes the best sense and how they would go about building up that policy part of it. And I think committing themselves to sustainable business model rather than one-off grant and doles, I think is absolutely critical. That you ultimately, if the terms of trade have to, form and there's a more balance to it, you need to build up economic organizations which can deal with the external, whether it's the business part of it, the government part of it, in a more sensible and sane manner. That's extremely important. And from the business part of it, last 1 minute, Carol, and I'll stick to time. In terms of the capacity building, I think businesses clearly need to look at it very carefully, that how they're engaging with the, it's not a transaction about buying. I think they need to work hard in terms of building capacity within the producers to manage their businesses better. Look at forming a more integrated play, that it's not just about terms of trade, buying price, quality. It is a little more than that. And how do you engage in a much more sort of integrated manner? That do you look at the livelihood? Do you look at their issues beyond just the produce part of it, in terms of how they're managing the growing part of it and what they need to do? And I think a very critical part is that, investing the time and resources to stay long-term and stay invested. I think that's absolutely crucial. So you cannot, have the tendency that, no, it doesn't work because politics is not right, the producers are not ready, that you would like to walk away from them. And I think that has been a bigger challenge part of it, that how do you stay invested in the relationship, in the engagement, and work long-term with the producers. And that is the absolute crucial part in the way the corporates will have to work. And I think in my summation, that yes, not all is lost or not all is well. I think the question of finding the middle ground, working together with the both at the policy level and with the producers, I think is really where the solution lies. And I think this continuum, as it develops and evolves, I think that is where we need to draw the lessons from how they're working and what the best part of that can be incorporated in the mainstreaming of the ag business and of the small producers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sanjeev. So we've now had 3 speakers. I think they were all 3 quite different, with Richard really setting the scene in terms of looking at broader developments around corporate social responsibility, looking at it from a very global perspective and changes over the years, and really recognizing now that there's really important progress to be observed. But at the same time, he's also inviting us to come up with concrete suggestions and ideas of how to really make it work. I think in that sense, Sanjeev's presentation is really about, okay, how does it work in the field? In India, I think the Indian context is very specific if you look at the policy environment, but from the company side, I think there are broader lessons to be learned. And I think you really nicely elaborated the challenges companies face in incorporating small-scale producers, and how to deal with that through corporate social responsibility strategies and the role of the government. And then, Chris, I think very nice insights in the fair trade movement. I think you really sketched also the achievements in terms of small-scale producers' empowerment, but also the struggle still going on, but also what can be learned by other standards from the fair trade movement and the experiences within that movement. So I would like now to invite all of you to bring up your thoughts, ideas, whether you recognize what they have presented, whether you see other developments, other challenges. So the floor is open.
Hello, my name is Frederik Gees. I work for Vigio. We are doing research on the level of corporate social responsibility, and this for socially responsible investors. So our research is in fact integrated later on in investments. We are mainly analyzing multinationals, and many of the multinationals of different sectors are actively claiming to contributing to development of smallholders. I think about supermarkets, also in the food sector. We have interesting examples, but I have one difficulty, and it's in the chemical sector. And in the chemical sector, we have companies who are producing pesticides, fertilizers, fungicides, herbicides. And those companies are in fact claiming that they can help smallholders for development. So my question is, should we grant a positive valuation to the projects of companies like Monsanto, Bayer Crop Science, Syngenta? And I was curious to hear of Mr. Ashtana, because of the Green Revolution was started in India at the time, and also those companies are very active in India. If you have good examples of those companies working together with small farmers, or if other persons have good examples, or considering that, for example, Mr. Olivier de Schutter, the UN Special Representative for the Right on Food, is mainly fighting for agroecology, which is kind of opposite towards the kind of products that those companies are offering towards smallholders.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly respond to the part in India. And again, I'll just see from the usage of the ag chemicals where India stands right now, that it's nearly 1/10 of where China is. In terms of, it's almost, in case if we look at Japan and South Korea, it would be absolutely not even 1/20th of that. So there are two parts to it. One is that the attack of pests and the agriculture, the way it is being done, clearly it's a serious problem and something needs to be done about it. And the concerns today in the developing countries are less and less in terms of what the what at a fundamental level, at a small producer part of it, and I'll take an example a little later about Monsanto's BT cotton and GMOs, how that was part. But to looking at the chemical part of it, that they have played a very good role, the large companies, in terms of how they've worked. But part of it, whether it's a responsible agriculture, in terms of the damage to the ecology, in terms of the studies being done exactly that what part is harmful and what is not. One big issue I find in the agriculture system is that there's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of anecdotal evidences in the way things are looked at, rather than very evidence-based research in terms of saying, yes, this is a specific damage and this is what can be done. And that, unfortunately, has not been a strong point in a lot of these debates, where a lot of this thing is either taken as a rhetorical, this is right or this is wrong. The fact is, yes, I think the truth part of it, whether the good stuff what the large companies did, and there are a lot of challenges around it. So clearly, whether you look at the the groundwater situation, where a lot of nitrate is straight going down, into the ground level, and which has had a serious impact on the health part of it. A lot of evidences and studies have shown that it has had a serious side effect in terms of the health part of it within the population, on the excessive use of both the chemical fertilizers like the nitrogenous fertilizers, as well as in terms of the intensive use of ag chemicals in certain crops. So I think that whole part of the way the civil society organizations, in terms of bringing that up, the private sector participating in that. But the regulation part of it, in terms of how government is managing to keep this in check and control, and how in responsible manner it can be used, I think that is what is the missing gap, and which is where a lot more work needs to be done, clearly. But I must say that the ag chemical industry in India is on a growth mode, so it's growing at 10%, and there is no stopping that till a point of time when it reaches a certain level. Where it becomes a part of a thing where either the producers realize or the government finds some alternate systems, whether the ag chemicals will be used or not used. So I think clearly it is not going away. That's a fact. And but within this fact, how is it used responsibly? How it is managed, both from policy and usage perspective? I think that is becoming very important now.
From a smallholder empowerment angle, there have. From what I've seen in terms of evidence, there's concerns about the negotiation interface, right? So if there's an interest in sort of creating a more democratic economy to some extent, when there are some of the large multinational companies, either for purveying some of the, in some cases there has become a dependence that's developed on certain pesticides and some fertilizers over time. So there can be risks, and there's an uneven relationship between, even a group of smallholders and the size of some of the companies they might be negotiating with. And there's a history of practices that have been documented through lawsuits, et cetera, that point to some of the corporations taking disproportionate advantage of these power inequalities. And the second point along the lines of agroecology is there is evidence and really following up on what Sanjeev said about the locally specific nature of agriculture. There's a lot of incredible effective practices like multi-cropping and agroforestry practices that have important yield benefits, that some of these culture practices are being lost and replaced by some of the more industrialized agricultural systems. So I would say if the interest is really in food security among smallholders, you might want to start from some of the existing practices that have proven effective and build from there. That doesn't completely answer, you'll have to decide what that means in terms of advising investors, but I would say that, as well as the question of food distribution, which we know is a bigger issue in terms of causing hunger than increasing yields.
Okay, I think it's good to really concentrate on the issue of smallholder empowerment, what really is the core of the debate for today. So you would like to bring in a new point of view.
My name is Dwight Justice. I wanted to comment on Richard Howitt's presentation. And the fact that we're here in the European Union facility, I think, gets to the point I wanted to make. There is a definition of corporate social responsibility by the European Union, which calls it a concept whereby companies integrate social and environmental concerns into their operations on a voluntary basis. And there's a lot of problems with that definition, but one of them is that's not the way the word responsibility is used in any European language, in any European country. The public understands responsibility differently. They understand responsibility as to be accountable for the consequences of your actions. And it doesn't matter whether or not there is a law or not. It is because obviously obeying the law is a responsibility, but also there are other consequences of your actions which may or may not be binding. Now, the reason all of this is important is I think it's shifted the public policy debate away from things that need to be talked about, which are the impacts of the activities of corporations. And if you define corporate social responsibility as something that is purely optional, then corporate social responsibility meetings become parades of do-good things that in philanthropy that companies do, but they're not expected to discuss the consequences of other things. Everything is always positive, and it's a setting for public-private partnerships and this and that. But it actually avoids what some of the real issues are. Now, in the field of corporate social responsibility, I think time is running out on this very poor, discredited political definition or redefinition of the word responsibility. If we look at the OECD guidelines that Richard Howitt mentioned, yes, it's true they're non-binding, but they're not a set of expectations that were based on things that the government said, well, we think these should only be voluntary. Every OECD member government has laws in the subject areas of the content of the guidelines. All they are saying when they're saying it's non-binding is they're saying this instrument, which is a set of agreed expectations, is not binding, but that they're not saying these are things that should not be binding. If you look at the adoption by the UN Human Rights Council on the Ruggie principles, which occurred 2 weeks ago, I think there is a very important element that addresses some of this. The Ruggie principles were based on a distinction, and a very clear and explicit distinction, between the role of the government in protecting human rights and the role of the company in respecting them. And that distinction is not a minor one. It's the whole point. And I think that what happens then is you see an emphasis in Ruggie on addressing impacts. The human rights and the responsibility of the company is to address the impact of their activities on human rights and on the whole range of human rights. And you have notions such as complicity and notions such as the responsibility for due diligence. All of this goes in the face of this political definition of corporate social responsibility used by the European Union, and I think implicit in the invitation to this event. And I don't think it's right. And one of the issues here is it's a governance issue. And if you're talking about the kind of governance crisis we have in the world today, whether the international level, the failure to develop the right kind of institutions, or if you're talking about the governance crisis in many countries, including in agriculture, you're dealing with something that it's real bad advice for the European Union to sort of export this redefinition of accountability and responsibility. It's not helping, it's actually hurting. Now, I'm not an expert in agriculture, I do follow labor practices and a lot of the corporate social responsibility in that area. And there hasn't been a large positive impact of CSR initiatives with respect to labor. And that may be a subject for another session. But I just wanted to say this remark about the definition of CSR. It's old, and thankfully I'm looking forward to the day when it's gone.
Okay, thank you. I think there was somebody who wanted to bring in something as well.
Yes, hello. My name is Karen Ber, and I am an assistant at the Center of Development Studies at the Catholic University of Leuven here in Belgium, and I am from Honduras. And it's more a comment than a question, but I'm going to base my comment on the Honduran case that I think is very interesting for the subject we are talking here. For several reasons, but the main is that the political elite in Honduras played a very important role in the military coup that took place in 2009. And then in the post-conflict, post-coup context, we see a very pro-business agenda being advanced. And in that context, also we see a lot of conflict being aggravated. I'm thinking about the Bahua One conflict, where we see there it's smallholders organizations that have believed the language of governance, development, participation that international organizations have been telling us for more than 20 years now. And they are now, as political actors, asking for the right to say the word on how land is used and distributed. And they are facing repression, very strong repression. Some actors of that repression are, well, the state, but also entrepreneurs that have been beneficiating for some financial schemes of the European Union on the basis of environmental advancement. And I think so the Honduran case shows how the proper business model is being questioned by reality, and it raises very important democracy issues. And the question that I'm willing to ask, I don't think that the answer is going to be fine here, but I think it's an important question, and how long, how far can we go in any development agenda without a political regulation and without a collective political empowerment of smallholders? Thank you.
My name is Johan de Klerk, and I work for Max Havelaar Belgium. So I'm part of the fair trade labeling environment, to say so. I am absolutely convinced that producer organizations can be credible and reliable business partners for our industry, for instance, here in Europe. So in that sense, apart from all the discussions about ownership and this and that, I think we are doing a pretty good job in that sense. I have an increasing problem with the Dutch. It's a provocative seminar, no? I have no problem with the Dutch people as such. I have a problem with the Dutch government, and I have a problem with the Dutch strategies when it comes down to international cooperation. What I see happening, and I'm running around the globe quite a bit, is that below the title of inclusive business, as it is called, Dutch government policy is redirecting its strategies from smallholders towards, let's say, big farmers and big industry. Meaning that in Peru and in a lot of other countries, small farmers have to compete at this moment. Over the last 2 years, it has been increasing. Have to compete with big farmers. This is not. It is not a myth. It is something which is existing, which is taking place at this very moment. There are huge funds which are spent by the Dutch government. And of course, the Dutch organizations who are executing in some way the strategy of the Dutch government are working in the same direction. Hivos, ICO, SNV, etc. we had the consequences of this at this moment is that it is confusing for producer organizations because there is a lot of money coming in for things which are apparently not beneficial for producer organizations. They are confusing also our consumers because Dutch NGOs, parastatal organizations are saying that whatever certification system is there, it's okay. It's not okay. My provocative challenge is that Dutch government and the organizations should make their homework very well and define very well what are the motors for development in most of the countries in the south. And on the basis of that analysis, define their strategy better. And I think the work has not been done so far. I think there are big signs that producer organizations can get empowered, but this work has not finished. So I would really love the Dutch to make their homework better. Thank you.
Well, I won't take it personal. I think that's one of the, let's say, the starting points for bringing up or starting these provocations to really challenge this whole thinking about pro-poor business approaches and whether they really work. So thanks for your criticism. I would like to now ask others also to step in because, as I said, I think it's a broader development we're seeing. And yes, the Dutch are part of that broader development. Go ahead.
I just want to comment on the Max Havelaar representative's remark. My name is Christoph Landert. I work for Expo Idea and as an external expert for CBI, which is a Dutch governmental agency that helps develop imports, that promotes imports to Europe from developing countries. And probably they're in a scheme that is not much appreciated by Johan in the corner there. However, the logic behind the approach is that if we succeed in creating stable employment with larger scale companies in countries with a developing economy, we're one step further. And they will really insist on the fact that within these larger farms, management is aware of values we have in Europe. And there has been like a value debate with Mr. Astana, who says there is no one-size-fits-all approach to CSR, whereas Mr. Howitt said we're not in for Europe-only solutions. The problem is that requirements relating to values and to CSR come from stream downwards. It's the European consumers who get increasingly aware that it's probably not a good idea to let cut flowers travel 10,000 miles or having strawberries in December. And I think this will affect further upstream the way we try to develop small and medium-sized farming projects in the south. So what the Dutch government does is trying to squeeze in on the management level or the employer level to make sure that whenever people in the south start working for a company, for a farm, at least they get a fair wage and they get some, what we call here, extra legal benefits. That was just my comment to Johan over there. Thank you.
Okay. Any response?
Thank you very much. My name is Teopista Akoi. I'm not giving a direct response to what he has said, but I have some remarks and questions related to what I heard both from the presentation of Sanjeev and the presentation of Chris. and yeah, and a combination of what other speakers have said. When I look at what we are calling pro-poor business and the relationship between development and empowerment of smallholder farmers, I look at two key issues in the whole thing. I look at the issue of governance of agriculture, the whole system, I mean, and I look at the issue of institutions. And I keep wondering, now, who is it that is going to help realize or stimulate these pro-poor business models? I'm speaking from my experience of working with farmers in Africa, and I'm looking specifically at the situation of sub-Saharan Africa. If business as we have today is predominantly, I'm not saying all, but predominantly about self-interest, and if we are in a situation where the world has moved, as we all know, the economies are liberalized and linked, and when I look at governments in sub-Saharan Africa, and you put them against any one big company here in Europe, you could just call them powerless. And then you combine that with the fact that we are in a period which is post-structural adjustment in sub-Saharan Africa, where you had as one of the policy packages privatization. And you have, during that process, a political elite, similar to the situation in Honduras probably, a political elite that appropriated double power. So they are in government, but they are in business as well. Now, if these pro-poor business models are supposed to emerge by a combination of stakeholders, so private business, public goods regulations, which is supposed to be done by government, and civil society, who then will be helping this to emerge in such a situation as Africa, where you have people that are playing double role. So if you are, for example, to say we need some kind of regulation, which is normally a role of government, some kind of regulation that would help new kind of institutions emerge, that would then support those kinds of business models. Who is going to do it? The people who are supposed to do it also have private interest. And they are at the same time sitting in government. And it's a little bit similar to the case of Monsanto and Syngenta that the gentleman there asked. If we have Monsanto and Syngenta investing a lot of money in biotechnology research, as a matter of fact, we need to have somebody investing in counter research, PhD level of scientists that are helping us. If we are going to try those seeds in a certain locality in Africa, we should have some genetic engineers studying the impact of those seeds on locally owned and controlled seeds. And the power is not balanced. You are just saying, let's try and experiment, and we do things with farmers. We are basically experimenting with people's lives. So you have their governance issues, unbalanced power relations. What are the kind of things we should be looking at to help these institutions and these governance questions to be solved so that these business models can emerge and be sustainable? Thank you.
Yo voy a tratar de hablar un poco en base a la experiencia nuestra en Latinoamérica, principalmente con comercio justo, pero también desde las organizaciones de productores y el día a día de lo que pasa allá en la práctica con todo lo que está pasando en el mundo. Yo coincido mucho con Johan porque lo que él decía es una práctica cotidiana en los últimos 2 años, por decirlo así, donde ha venido cambiando los modelos de apoyo de la cooperación a nuestros países, y no solo Holanda, otros países también con la misma forma de llegar a hacer negocios, apoyando a las grandes compañías en nuestros países, en teoría para que apoyen a los pequeños productores. Cuando vi la invitación, lo que me hizo venir, porque tenía muchas cosas que hacer, lo que me hizo venir es precisamente los temas alrededor de responsabilidad social y de los negocios inclusivos. Los famosos negocios inclusivos, que de muy buena fe pueden apoyarlos y creer que de esa manera estamos fortaleciendo y desarrollando a los pequeños productores en nuestros países, efectivamente podría generar ciertas relaciones de negocios para algunos, pero destruyendo lo que otros han construido. Porque se profundiza el tema de competencia desleal, que es un tema que nosotros hemos venido conversando durante muchos años en el sistema de comercio justo, que lamentablemente a veces la gente critica más, pero critica más porque es el...
Criticize a lot because they have done a lot also in fair trade. This is the model that we know, so it is quite tempting to criticize it more. And it has many flaws indeed, but nonetheless it has the one that has advanced the most in this subject matter. We mentioned all these things in the document that we prepared for this provocation seminar. We want to talk about the empowerment. Well, empowerment can be understood in different ways. Some think that it means to take the destiny into your own hands, to decide on your own lives. But how can you empower yourself without resources, without technical assistance, without support? How can you decide on your life if you have to do business with an intermediary party? So we have to understand these things in a very unequal balance of powers. Imagine this metaphor. There is a tiger that comes to us, but we are all donkeys that are tied up. So we are going to be dependent in this chain. We have achieved certain things in fair trade. We have made many advances in Latin America. More than 300,000 families have benefited from the system. But if we change course and we take if we swap our methods for other ones within the fair trade, and if we direct fair trade into other direction, we are going to lose what we have achieved by now in fair trade. So there are some tools that we are developing that could damage other people, so we have to have a broader reflection on this end.
Okay, thank you for this. I think you will come back on this also during your presentation after the break. I see many people becoming warmed up for the debate, but looking at the time, I would suggest to have a 5-minute break, after which we will continue and we will have 3 other presentations. So, but please note down the points you would like to bring into the debate.